So I shared a couple of weeks ago that I have been hesitant to go through the book of Proverbs, right? For 10 years, I've thought about it a couple times, but I haven't wanted to talk about it because unlike Revelation, which I thought was too difficult, and I was not sure about what it was talking about, Proverbs, on the other hand, is too simple, right? When I stand up here in front of you, I'd like to bring something to the table, right? I like to say something that maybe makes you go, I didn't know that, or wow, that's cool, that's interesting information. But Proverbs is going to be very difficult to make that happen because it's so on the surface. You can just, I asked you a couple weeks ago to start reading on September 1st a chapter a day of Proverbs. How many of you have been doing that? Excellent. Good. Well, I hope you have found it valuable and worthwhile. I know I have. And even though I've done that many, many times, through the months, still, every time I read it, I feel led. I feel God interacting with me and opening my eyes to see what He's saying to me. So I hope that you guys are finding out the same thing. So I've been hesitant to preach through the book of Proverbs. But on the other hand, as in the spring, was my 10th anniversary here, and as I was going over what I thought about the ministry and that sort of thing, I thought maybe I haven't been practical enough, right? I've talked a great deal about God's love and about His work in the world and the necessity of prayer and reading the Bible and coming to church and all those sort of things, but I haven't really dug into the practicality of the Christian faith. The Christian faith is something that should guide us in our everyday decisions. It's an incredibly practical thing. And I don't know over the past 10 years if I have done a good job of emphasizing the practicality of the Bible in our lives. So by going through Proverbs now over the next couple of months, that will certainly fix that. Because to be honest with you, there is no more practical book in the Bible than the book of Proverbs. As we go through this, we're going to see very precise things about our marriages and about our employment and about how to deal with our farm animals. I mean, I know that sounds funny, but it's true. I mean, it's full of our day-to-day lives that if we apply it, then God will use these principles to help us to grow and to thrive in the world that He has created. So the Bible is very practical, and so let me just take a parenthesis here and say about our upcoming small groups on Wednesday night, to start a week from Wednesday, that is also going to be very practical. We're going to be studying conflict, and in our day and age today, our lives are full of conflict, whether that's political conflict or conflict in our homes with our spouse or with our children or conflicts with our neighbors or conflicts over politics or whether we're going to wear masks or not wear masks or get vaccinated. I mean, conflict is everywhere. And it seems like since the whole COVID thing started, it seems like it's really mushroomed. You feel that too? So the Bible has some very practical guides of how to deal with conflict. And so that's what our next study on Wednesday nights is going to be about. It's an 8-week study dealing with conflict. So I hope you all will sign up. I think it should be a good time. But anyway, back to Proverbs, parenthesis close. I'm going to do this the same way that we did the book of Revelation, right? We didn't go through and try to explain every single thing because Proverbs doesn't lend itself to that. But what we are going to do is we are going to look at the themes, because just like the book of Revelation, the book of Proverbs can be separated into themes that don't necessarily go chapter by chapter by chapter, but there's a ton of information about these various themes that we're going to be seeing. But of course, today is day 1 of our new series, and so we have to ask some questions, right? And you guys know the questions, right? Who, what, why, where, when, and how. Every time you start a book of the Bible, you got to find out who's talking, when they were talking, what they're talking about, all this kind of stuff. So today, though I just promised you a great deal of practicality, probably not going to be as practical as in the weeks to come. So let's get started. with our book of Proverbs. Right from chapter 1, verse 1, we get the answer to who wrote, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who wrote the book of Proverbs. That's point one, is who. And it's the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel. So we know that Solomon is the creator of the book of Proverbs. Now I say creator because while it's very possible that Solomon actually wrote all of these Proverbs, it's said that he wrote over 3,000 Proverbs in his life. It's also possible that he didn't write them all, but he collected them and he put them down, even if he didn't originate them. But it doesn't really matter if Solomon actually spoke them or wrote them himself, because we know that this is Scripture. And so these principles that are written down, these Proverbs, they're from God, and they are valuable to us today. They are things that we should know as we live our lives. Who is he writing it to? Well, he tells us here. He tells us he's talking to people who are simple and want to become wise, people who are wise and want to become wiser, people who want to receive instruction in wisdom, people who want to understand. So he's talking to a group of people, much like you, who want to understand the wisdom of God. That's what I want in my life, right? I want to know the wisdom of God, and I hope that that's something that you're seeking as well, because seeking is the first step in finding the wisdom of God. Actually, that's not true at all, but I'll correct myself in a little bit. The second thing is throughout the book, and as you have been reading it, those of you who have been going through, you've already seen that Solomon is addressing, quote, my son. Have you noticed that? My son, listen to your father's instruction. My son this, my son that. And so I believe, and it's likely that Solomon was literally addressing his son, that he was putting together this book of Proverbs. For he was the king. He was the third king of Israel, the son of David. He was the greatest king of Israel as far as his wealth and as far as his knowledge and wisdom. And so he was probably preparing to pass on the kingdom to one of his sons. And so I think that he was literally talking to my son, and listen to me, be wise with the kingdom. This is how success comes from. But he wasn't only talking to his son. And honestly, when I read that, I always think of God speaking to me. When it says, my son, listen, I think that's God speaking to me. And I know that Solomon wasn't thinking of me when he wrote it. I know that God wasn't talking to me exactly. But that's how we ought to read the book of Proverbs, as if it's God speaking to us directly. So it's Solomon wrote it. Who is he writing it to? Anyone who wants wisdom and instruction. Anyone who wants to be wiser than they are today. The second point on your outline is why. Why did he write it? And again, verse 2, Solomon's cooking right with him. He says that men may know wisdom and instruction, understand words of insight, receive instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. So he wants people to know wisdom. So before we go on, we should probably define what wisdom is, right? If Solomon thinks that's that important, then what exactly is he talking about? What is wisdom? So I think an excellent definition, a working definition for us, and it may not be in Webster's, I don't know, but I think the perfect definition of biblical wisdom is correct knowledge, or right knowledge, correctly applied. You need both halves of that statement to be wise. You need to know the right stuff, and you need to apply the right stuff. Half of it won't work. If you know the right stuff, yeah. So let me give you an example. This has just been this week. 4 people this week have said this to me in some combination. They didn't all quote the exact same words, but they all said, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. Okay? Is that true? Yes. That is absolutely true. That is a correct statement. That is correct knowledge. You don't have to go to church to be a Christian. But on the other hand, you don't have to have a parachute to jump out of a plane either, right? I mean, just because you can be a Christian without going to church doesn't mean that you should be a Christian without going to church. God has set the fellowship of the church up for our benefit, and it's a good thing. And people who choose, they say, I'm a Christian and I'm not going to church, if that is their choice, then they are going to feel much the same impact of the person who jumps out of the plane without a parachute, right? Eventually, the impact of that decision will hit them in a negative way. Correct knowledge, incorrectly applied. There's a reason that we come to church, and it's good for us, and it's a principle that we find in the Bible. But still, I don't know. What do you think? You guys are all looking at me now like, what's your point? My point is we have to know the truth and apply the truth correctly. If we try to apply the people who said this to me about church, they were telling me basically, in their own way, that they weren't coming to church, and they weren't going to go to church. They didn't want to go to church. They didn't see a value in church. Okay, that's fine. They were Christians anyway. Okay. And yet, they had that knowledge, and they applied it wrong. They applied it incorrectly. All right, so wisdom is that knowledge, right knowledge, applied correctly. And that's what Solomon is writing this for, so that his son, people who are seeking wisdom, will know not only the right knowledge, but the right way to apply it. The third point on your outline is what? What is Proverbs? What is he talking about? What's going on here? And I've already mentioned it. What Solomon is really wanting to get is timeless principles for life, right? That's the point he's trying to get across. He wants his son, he wants wise people to know what are the timeless principles that we could base our lives on. Now, it's important to notice that these are principles and not promises, right? There's many principles here that if a righteous man will have long life, okay? That's a principle that we find in Proverbs over and over and over. Now, is that always true? No. You know, we remembered 9/11 yesterday. And I bet that there were many people who knew Christ and were righteous in their walks with him on those towers on that day, and yet their lives were snuffed out too soon. So it wasn't a promise, it was a principle. Generally speaking, if you walk righteously, you will have a longer life than people who don't walk in righteousness, right? If you are taking care of doing the right thing in your neighborhood and in your body and with your God, if you're doing those things, you are generally going to have a long life than somebody who is a criminal, right? Somebody who is in jail, someone who's hanging with a bad crowd. The danger for them and their life is more likely to be shortened than the person who walks in righteousness. Is that news? No, I don't think that's news. And that's why sometimes it's hard to preach through Proverbs, is because none of you are surprised by that. And yet at the same time, it's an important principle that we're going to find over and over and over in Proverbs. All right, that was number 3, was what? We had who, why, what. And now we're going to talk about how Solomon is going to communicate this. And so those of you who have been reading already, you have already started to see over the last 2 days, right? Really, when we got to chapter 10, we really started the process of seeing the main body of Proverbs. And you'll see that it's mainly done in couplets. This was a Jewish way of writing and speaking. And so the couplets are basically, the first line says something, and then the second line emphasizes the first line. So even though they use different words, they're basically saying the same thing. Sometimes they emphasize it by repeating it. Sometimes they emphasize it by saying the opposite, right? So a righteous man lives a long life, an unrighteous man dies quickly, right? It's pretty straightforward. They're saying the same thing, but they're saying it in the opposite way. And they use a lot of pictures in the Proverbs, because pictures are easy to remember. So, for instance, in chapter 6, where am I here? Verse 27, we read, Can a man carry fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. None who touches her will go unpunished. So it's a picture to tell us a truth. The picture is if some dingbat tries to carry a fire in their arms, what's going to happen? They're going to get burned, right? Well, what's going to happen if a man goes to his neighbor's wife? Also going to get burned, right? It's a picture that shows us, that illustrates a truth for us. And so we see all kinds of pictures. And some of these pictures that we're going to see are strange to us because we don't live in that same culture, right? So the digging that we need to do is not to find out the deep secret thoughts, but to find out what is the culture then telling us that we can apply today. And remembering that these principles can apply to us today, even if they're talking about farm animals. I don't have any farm animals, but that'll work, right? So when I read something like, where there is no ox, the manger is clean, right? What does that mean? Yeah. Well, when we get to that, we'll talk about it. But the point is that that particular proverb has meaning for us today, even though I personally don't own an ox, right? Still, we can apply these things to ourselves if we dig a little bit. If we can't just read it quickly and say, okay, I'm done, I did my time, right? We have to dig a little bit to figure out what exactly these proverbs are talking about. They come to us in pictures. The other thing that we're going to see a lot in Proverbs is personification. Right, and those of you who are reading along have already seen that, right? You've seen two main characters introduced already. One is the wise woman, the woman of wisdom, and the other is the woman of folly. Right? Now, that doesn't mean it's a literal wise woman and a literal woman of folly. These are personifications of people who are seeking wisdom and what that looks like, and people who are not seeking wisdom, people who are going the wrong direction because the woman of folly has drawn them aside. So sometimes when we read about adultery, for instance, that certainly is applicable to people who are thinking about committing adultery, right? They may say in the book of Proverbs, oh, look, it says don't commit adultery. Wow, news. But it's not just adultery, right? It's anything that would take us away from the path the Lord has for us, the path of wisdom. Anything that takes us off that path is not just adultery, but idolatry in the eyes of our God. And so we can see Proverbs guiding us along the path of wisdom. And then the question comes, of course, why on earth? Why did he write it this way? Why did he make it so difficult to understand? And the answer is it's not that difficult to understand, one. And the second of all, it's easier to remember. When you're talking about couplets and you're talking about pictures and you're talking about things that get repeated over and over, it's easier to remember than just writing a paragraph. Oh, by the way, stay away from adultery and watch out for that ox in the main, all that kind of stuff. This is an easy way for people who, not all of them could read, but they could pass this knowledge on from generation to generation to generation, just like we should be doing in our families as well. All right. Who? Mostly Solomon. Why? So that people who want wisdom can find it. What? God's timeless principles, the instructions that he has given us of how to live. How? Couplets, comparisons, personification, pictures. This is not just in Proverbs, of course. The Bible is full of this sort of communication. But that's basically Proverbs in a nutshell. That's how it works. And finally, and probably the most important thing I'm going to say, so those of you who have totally zoned out so far, listen to this next part, okay? The last part is the key to understanding Proverbs, comes in verse 7. Ready? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. As we seek the knowledge of God, we have to start with the fear of the Lord. Now, fear has changed its meaning over time. It doesn't mean to be afraid of. It means to be in awe of. It means to worship. So I would paraphrase it as saying the worship of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. If you want to know God's knowledge, if you want to know how to apply it correctly, We have to begin with the worship of God. And so we pick up the Bible and we read it, not just Proverbs, but any of it, but Proverbs in particular. We have to read it as an act of worship. The problem with my saying, read a chapter every day, is it's too easy to get in the habit of picking it up every day, and then you read it, and then 2 seconds later you don't remember a thing you read. You had some of that experience this week? I have, right? And the reason is because my mind would wander, and so I say, Lord, thank you for bringing me back. I go back to the last point I can remember, and I start reading again. And I read, asking, I say, God, help me understand what you are saying to me. Not just what you're saying generally, not just what you're saying to the church at large or Christians around the world. How can I apply what you're saying to me? That's the key. That's the key to understanding the Bible. It's the key to understanding the book of Proverbs. We have to worship as we read. It can't just be a habit. It has to be an act of worship. It's a good habit too, by the way, but it's better as an act of worship. So that's what we're doing over the next couple months. We're going to look at the book of Proverbs. We're going to look at these principles. We're going to look at how we can apply them to ourselves. And the practical application that we have today is to read the book as an act of worship. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So if you're reading already, maybe make a new commitment to think about that, to spend 2 minutes in prayer before you start reading, asking for the Lord's wisdom to open your eyes to what he has to say. And if you haven't started reading Proverbs yet, that's okay. Just pick it up. Today's the 12th. Read chapter 12 this afternoon. Read chapter 13 tomorrow and 14 the day after that. One chapter at a time, little bites, seeking the Lord's best. And I guarantee you, if you do that, the Lord will open your eyes to something. I don't remember the whole passage after I'm done, but there will inevitably be a verse or 2, or maybe even 3, that the Lord convicts me to understand and to apply. And that's what walking with God is all about, is correct knowledge, correctly applied, in his Spirit as he empowers us and for his glory. So let's do that today. Let's